I waited 7 years to turn on my son's laptop because I was afraid of what it might say about me. When I finally did, the backups told me something the police never did. My son didn't jump from that bridge, and the truth was scheduled to be uploaded after he was already dead. Before I begin, if you've ever lived with unanswered questions, if grief followed you longer than anyone warned you it would, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube. Sometimes telling these stories out loud is the only way they stop echoing inside us. I used to believe grief had an expiration date. People didn't say it outright, but they acted like it did. They brought casseroles for a few weeks, called every day for a month, then slowly returned to their lives, while I stayed right where my son left me, on a cold bridge with a police report folded too many times in my coat pocket. His name was Daniel. He was 22 when they said he jumped. I remember the officer's voice more than his face. Gentle, practiced, as if he'd said those words 100 times before. I nodded like a man who understood, even though nothing in me did. Daniel's laptop came home in a cardboard box with his shoes and wallet. I put it in the closet without opening it. I told myself I was respecting his privacy. The truth was simpler. I was afraid that if I opened it, I'd find proof that I'd missed something obvious, a note, a search history full of despair, evidence that I wasn't paying attention. So I left it there. Years passed, dust settled, birthdays came and went like quiet apologies. I learned how to function with a hollow place inside my chest, learned how to answer, "How many kids do you have?" without correcting myself. 7 years later, the closet needed cleaning. That's the lie I tell people. The truth is, I'd had a dream where Daniel was standing in the kitchen, older than I remembered him, asking me why I still hadn't looked. I woke up with my heart pounding and couldn't shake the feeling that I was being left behind by my own fear. The box was lighter than I remembered. His laptop still had the same dull sticker on the lid, peeling at the corners. I carried it to the dining table like something fragile. It took me a while to find the charger. When the screen finally lit up, the glow felt almost intrusive, like I turned on a light in a room that had been dark on purpose. The login screen stared back at me. His password was still the same one he'd used since high school. That hurt more than it should have. It felt like proof that some parts of him never changed, no matter how much I'd convinced myself he must have. At first, I didn't know what I was looking for. I clicked through folders like a stranger wandering a city without a map. Photos of his dog, half-finished college essays, music files named after emotions instead of artists. Then I found a folder labeled Backups. That word made my stomach tighten. It sounded deliberate, prepared. Inside were dated archives, automatically saved. I almost closed it. My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart warning me that some doors don't open quietly. The first thing that didn't make sense was the time. The official report said Daniel died at 11:42 p.m. The backups kept going past midnight. At first, I assumed it was a glitch. Computers do that. I told myself not to be dramatic, but the timestamps were consistent. Files saved at 12:17 a.m., 12:48, 1:03. My mouth went dry. I checked the system clock history, half expecting to find something wrong. It was accurate. It had synced automatically. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing. Grief teaches you how to doubt your own reactions. I told myself there was a simple explanation. There always is until there isn't. When I looked again, I noticed folders I hadn't seen before, names that didn't match anything I knew about his life, short video clips that wouldn't play all the way through. Corrupted, the system said. I clicked one anyway. It froze on a blurry frame of streetlights and a slice of Daniel's face reflected in glass. My hand started to shake. I wasn't a tech person. I'd spent my life fixing things with tools, not code. But grief makes you resourceful. I searched online for ways to recover corrupted files, followed instructions slowly, afraid I'd make things worse. Hours passed without me noticing. Outside, the light changed. Inside, my son's life began to rearrange itself into something I didn't recognize. There were GPS logs. That surprised me. Daniel always said tracking was creepy, but there they were. Dates, coordinates, routes. The night he died, his phone and laptop had recorded movement that didn't lead to the bridge, it led away from it. I traced the path with my finger on the screen, my chest tightening with every turn. The bridge was there, marked briefly like a pause. Then the trail continued. Whoever said he jumped hadn't followed him long enough. I felt something dangerous bloom inside me. Not hope, anger, the kind that waits patiently for years and then stretches its limbs. I remembered the way the investigation ended so quickly. No witnesses, no note. Sometimes the detective said, there aren't answers. I accepted that because accepting it was easier than fighting everyone who wanted me to move on. The videos came back in fragments, no sound at first. Daniel sitting in a car, glancing over his shoulder, street signs I didn't recognize, a timestamp at the bottom corner that pulsed like a heartbeat. One clip ended abruptly, as if someone had grabbed the device. Another showed the inside of a parking garage. I watched them over and over, my mind trying to fill in the spaces between frames, trying to remember conversations I dismissed as small talk, questions I hadn't asked. Then I found the scheduled task, a file set to upload to a cloud account at 2 a.m., hours after Daniel was supposed to be dead. It hadn't uploaded. The connection had failed, but the intent was there, clear and undeniable. My son had planned to send something, evidence, a message. I sat there in the quiet house, the weight of that realization pressing down on me until I couldn't tell where my grief ended and something else began. For the first time since the funeral, I said his name out loud and didn't feel like it shattered me. It steadied me. If Daniel hadn't jumped, then he hadn't chosen to leave me that way. And if someone wanted the bridge to be the end of the story, they underestimated what a father will do when he finally stops being afraid of the truth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the dining table with Daniel's laptop humming softly, the way it used to hum in his bedroom when he stayed up too late. Every few minutes, I'd reach out and touch the edge of the table just to remind myself I was still here, that this wasn't some cruel trick my mind was playing to avoid letting go. Grief can do that. It can build entire worlds if you give it enough time. But this felt different. This felt solid, like a bruise you can press and know exactly where it hurts. By morning, I had printed out the GPS logs. I needed them on paper, something I could hold. I spread them across the table like a map of a country I'd never meant to visit. The bridge was there, yes, but it was a brief stop, not an ending. After that, the trail moved south into an industrial part of the city Daniel had no reason to be in. Warehouses, storage units, empty stretches of road. I tried to remember if he'd ever mentioned that area. All I came up with were memories of him shrugging when I asked where he was going, telling me not to worry so much. That was my role, after all, the worrier, the one who asked too many questions when he was alive and somehow not enough when it mattered. I could feel guilt circling every thought, looking for a place to land. I pushed it away and focused on what I could do next. The corrupted videos were my best lead. I spent hours running recovery software, watching progress bars crawl forward like they were thinking about it. When one finally opened with sound, I had to turn the volume down because hearing his voice without warning felt like being shoved underwater. He wasn't talking to the camera, he was talking to someone else. "I told you," he said, his voice tight, controlled. "I'm not doing this again." There was another voice, distorted, impatient. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried something sharp, a threat maybe, or a warning. The clip ended with a sudden jolt, the image swinging sideways. I sat back, my hands clenched so hard my knuckles ached. I paused the video on Daniel's face just before it cut out. He looked older than 22 in that moment, tired, focused, like someone who'd been carrying a secret too heavy for his frame. I realized then how much I'd relied on the idea that his death was his choice. It had allowed me to grieve without asking harder questions about who else might have failed him, about who else might have wanted him quiet. I went back to the police report. I'd kept it in a folder I never opened, like a relic I was afraid to disturb. Reading it now felt like reading fiction written by someone who hadn't bothered with details. No mention of GPS data, no attempt to recover digital files. The conclusion was clean, too clean. Suicide. Case closed. I wondered how many other families had been handed the same neat ending, how many had accepted it because fighting felt impossible. There was a name that kept appearing in Daniel's messages, half erased, fragmented. M. Sometimes just an initial, sometimes a username. I traced it through emails, chat logs, files hidden in directories I didn't know existed. It led me to a burner account on an encrypted platform. Accessing it felt like stepping into a room Daniel had locked on purpose, but I was already past the point of pretending I could turn back. The messages weren't confessions, they were negotiations. Daniel pushing back, asking for time, saying things like, "You promised this wouldn't hurt anyone," and "I won't be your scapegoat." My chest tightened as I read. This wasn't a boy drowning in despair. This was a young man cornered, trying to reason his way out of something dangerous. The last message he sent was unsent, stuck in draft form, time-stamped minutes before the trail stopped moving. It read, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't—" I couldn't finish it. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms against my eyes until sparks of light danced behind them. For years, I'd imagined Daniel alone on that bridge, the weight of his own thoughts pushing him over the edge. Now I saw him elsewhere, arguing, resisting, believing he'd have another chance to explain. That image hurt more than the first one because it meant hope had been stolen from him, not surrendered. I drove to the bridge that afternoon. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Standing there, listening to cars rush past, I tried to picture the official version of events. A quiet jump, no witnesses, no struggle. It felt wrong in my body, like wearing clothes that didn't belong to me. I pulled out the printed GPS map and followed it with my eyes, letting the paper flutter in the wind. The bridge wasn't the end. It was a misdirection. I didn't know who to trust. The police had closed the door gently but firmly. Friends told me reopening wounds wouldn't bring peace. But peace had never been the goal. Understanding was. I contacted a digital forensics specialist I found through a support forum for families like mine. I didn't tell him everything at first. I just asked if timestamps could lie. He said they could be altered, but patterns were harder to fake. When I showed him the data, his silence on the other end of the call told me enough. "There's more here," he said finally, "and someone didn't want you to see it." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the last conversation Daniel and I had. He'd asked me if I trusted him. I'd laughed it off, told him of course I did. Now I understood the question for what it was, a test, an invitation, one I hadn't recognized in time. But trust, I was learning, doesn't end when someone dies. Sometimes it begins there. If uncovering the truth meant losing the version of my son I'd clung to for comfort, then so be it. I owed him more than a clean story. I owed him the messy, dangerous truth, even if it changed everything I thought I knew about him, about myself, about the world that let his story be buried so easily. The forensic specialist's name was Aaron. He spoke softly, like someone who'd learned that volume didn't make hard truths easier to hear. We met in his small office above a print shop that smelled faintly of ink and burnt coffee. I brought Daniel's laptop in a backpack, the way I used to carry his lunch when he forgot it on the counter. Handing it over felt like giving up custody all over again. Aaron didn't promise anything. He never said the word justice. He said things like context and corroboration and chain of events. He treated Daniel's data like a voice that needed translation, not proof that needed forcing. As he worked, I watched the screen reflect in his glasses, lines of code scrolling past like a language I was too old to learn. I sat with my hands folded, afraid that if I moved, the truth might slip away again. When he called me a week later, his voice was different. Not excited, careful. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I'd been sitting for 7 years. He said the backups confirmed what I'd suspected. The data showed continuity. Daniel's phone and laptop were active well after the supposed time of death. Not sporadically, purposefully. Someone else had handled the devices too, clumsily, leaving behind digital fingerprints that didn't match my son's habits. This wasn't a jump, Aaron said, and it wasn't random. I hung up and stared at the wall until the light shifted. The relief I'd expected didn't come. Instead, a heavy responsibility settled in my chest. Knowing meant acting, and acting meant inviting forces into my life that had already proven they weren't afraid to erase a young man and call it tragedy. The next discovery came from the cloud account Daniel had tried to upload to. Aaron managed to recover fragments of what never fully sent, pieces of documents, screenshots, a video file broken into jagged sections like shattered glass. We watched it together in his office, the sound low. Daniel was sitting across from someone, the camera angled down as if hidden. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. He was talking about money moving through shell companies, about data breaches disguised as accidents. He named a firm I recognized from local headlines, a company that sponsored community events and donated to police charities. The other person's face never appeared, but their voice did. Calm, assured. They spoke like consequences were theoretical things that happened to other people. When Daniel said he was going to the authorities, the tone changed, sharper. "You don't understand how this works," the voice said. "You don't get to walk away." The video cut out then, the file corrupted beyond repair. I felt sick. This wasn't a private crisis. This was a collision with something larger, something that had the means to clean up after itself. I went home and locked my doors, a habit I'd fallen out of years ago. I started noticing things I'd dismissed before, a car idling too long outside my house, emails that bounced back when I tried to send them attachments, the way my phone battery drained faster after certain calls. Paranoia, I told myself, grief looking for patterns. But a part of me knew better. When you learn how carefully a lie was constructed, you start to see the scaffolding everywhere. I contacted a journalist I trusted, someone who'd written about corporate misconduct with a stubbornness I admired. I didn't give him everything. I gave him enough to make him curious. He listened without interrupting, asked questions that told me he understood the stakes. "Once this starts," he said, "it doesn't stop cleanly." I told him it already hadn't. The hardest part wasn't the fear. It was the way Daniel kept changing in my mind. Each new piece of evidence added depth and distance at the same time. He was braver than I'd known, more involved, less innocent. I grieved him again, this time for the man he'd become without me noticing. I wondered how many dinners he'd sat through, nodding along while carrying this secret alone. How many chances I'd had to ask the right question and chose comfort instead. One evening, while sorting through more recovered files, I found an audio recording Daniel had labeled simply Dad. My hands shook as I clicked it. His voice filled the room, quiet and close. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then I didn't get the chance to explain. I need you to know I tried to do the right thing. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you scared. I know that sounds backwards. I'm sorry." He paused, breathing uneven. "Whatever they say, remember this wasn't my choice." I sat on the floor and cried until my chest hurt. Not the restrained crying I'd perfected over the years, but the kind that bends you forward, that leaves you empty and raw. When it passed, something solid remained underneath. Resolve. Daniel hadn't wanted me protected by ignorance. He'd wanted me protected by truth. I'd mistaken one for the other. The journalist called back 2 days later. He'd confirmed parts of Daniel's claims through his own sources, enough to warrant deeper digging, enough to make powerful people uncomfortable. "You need to be prepared," he said. "They'll question your motives. They'll paint this as a grieving father seeing what he wants to see." I laughed then, a short, humorless sound. Wanting had nothing to do with it anymore. I visited Daniel's grave before everything broke open. I told him what I was doing, what might happen. The wind moved through the trees like a quiet response. For the first time since his death, I felt like I was speaking to him, not at his absence. I promised him I wouldn't stop halfway. Not this time. When the first article went live, my phone rang nonstop. Old friends, strangers, a call from the police department asking to clarify some things. The story didn't accuse anyone outright. It didn't need to. It asked questions that refused to stay buried. And once those questions were out in the open, the bridge stopped being the end of Daniel's story. It became the place where a lie began to unravel. The days after the article came out blurred together in a way I can only describe as noisy silence. My phone was always buzzing, my inbox filling faster than I could read, yet the house felt quieter than it ever had. Daniel's room stayed exactly the same, the bed neatly made, the posters curling at the corners. I found myself standing in the doorway more often, as if the truth I'd released into the world might drift back to where it all began and settle there. The police called again, this time with a different tone, no longer gentle, no longer certain. They asked me to come in, said they wanted to review new information. I brought copies of everything Aaron had verified, neatly organized, labeled the way I used to label Daniel's school folders when he was younger. Sitting across from them, I watched their eyes flicker as timelines unraveled. I saw disbelief give way to irritation, irritation to something like concern. They asked why I hadn't come forward sooner. I told them the truth, because I was afraid, because I trusted their original conclusion, because grief doesn't make you brave, it makes you tired. Outside the station, a man I didn't recognize approached me. He said my name like he already knew me. He introduced himself as a representative of the company mentioned in the article, spoke with polished sympathy about my loss. He suggested, gently, that digging further would only prolong my pain. He talked about settlements, about preserving Daniel's memory with dignity. I listened, my hands steady at my sides, and realized this was the moment everything inside me aligned. "My son's memory doesn't need protecting," I said. "The truth does." His smile thinned. We parted without shaking hands. That night, my house was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. They left Daniel's laptop untouched on the dining room table, exactly where I'd left it. The message was clear enough. I sat on the couch until dawn, the lights on, listening to every creak and sigh the house made. Fear sat with me, but it didn't own me. It couldn't, not after what I'd already survived. More articles followed. Other journalists picked up the thread. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into investigations. Former employees came forward, anonymous at first, then braver. patterns emerged. Daniel wasn't the first person who tried to step out of line. He was just the one whose silence had been made permanent and public. The bridge, I learned, had been used before, a convenient symbol, an ending that discouraged questions. In the midst of it all, I found myself thinking about the small moments I'd overlooked when Daniel was alive, the way he hesitated before answering simple questions, the nights he came home later than usual, eyes alert, mind elsewhere. I'd chalked it up to growing up, to independence. I forgave myself slowly, understanding that parents don't fail because they don't love enough. They fail because they can't imagine the worst until it's already happened. The police reopened the case officially. They didn't call it an apology, but it felt like one. They asked for my cooperation, my patience. I gave them the first and struggled with the second. Every step forward stirred up another wave of grief. Each confirmation felt like losing Daniel all over again, then finding him in a different form. Not the boy I tucked in, not the young man I buried, but someone in between, still becoming, still choosing. One afternoon, I received a letter in Daniel's handwriting. I recognized it instantly, the slight slant, the careful loops. It had been sent anonymously, found among materials seized during a raid. Daniel had written it months before his death, addressed to no one. It talked about fear, about responsibility, about the strange loneliness of doing the right thing when it isolates you. He wrote that he hoped someday someone would understand why he couldn't stay quiet. I pressed the paper to my chest and felt something ease, just a little. The company denied everything, of course. Lawyers spoke in rehearsed phrases, but denial has a shelf life when enough light is shined on it. Arrests followed, not the top names, not yet, but enough to signal that the story was no longer contained. I watched the news from my living room, Daniel's photo appearing on screen not as a tragedy, but as a witness. For the first time, the narrative shifted. He wasn't just a victim, he was a catalyst. People began reaching out to me, mostly parents. They thanked me for not letting the story end where it was supposed to. They told me about their own unanswered questions, their own unopened boxes. I answered when I could, listened more than I spoke. There was no advice I could give them that would make their pain smaller, but there was honesty, and sometimes that's enough to keep someone going. As the months passed, the intensity faded into something steadier. The fear lessened, the anger softened. What remained was a quiet pride that surprised me. Not pride in myself, but in Daniel, in the choices he'd made when no one was watching, in the way his voice, nearly erased, had found a way back through circuits and backups, and a father who finally stopped looking away. I returned to the bridge one last time. I stood there without the papers, without the weight of not knowing. Cars rushed by, indifferent as ever. I whispered goodbye, not because I was letting go of Daniel, but because I was letting go of the lie that had haunted us both. His story didn't end here. It never had. And as I walked away, I understood the moral I'd been circling all along. Love doesn't mean preserving a comforting version of the people we lose. It means honoring who they truly were, even when the truth is complicated, even when it costs us the safety of not knowing. That's the inheritance Daniel left me, and it's one I intend to carry carefully for the rest of my life. After the arrests, people assumed the hardest part was over. They told me I could rest now, that justice had started moving and would finish the job on its own. What they didn't understand was that momentum doesn't soothe the parent's heart. If anything, it gives your mind more room to wander. With the crisis no longer consuming every hour, the quieter questions came back. The ones about who Daniel had been when I wasn't looking, and who I had been as his father when he needed more than my assumptions. I started seeing a counselor at the insistence of my sister. At first, I went just to make her stop worrying. I sat on the edge of the chair, arms crossed, answering questions with facts instead of feelings. But one afternoon, she asked me who Daniel was to me before the investigation began. The question knocked the air out of my lungs. I realized how much my memory of him had been overwritten by reports and evidence and headlines. I talked about the boy who used to fall asleep during car rides, the teenager who pretended not to care when I embarrassed him, the young man who hugged me quickly, like affection was something he had to ration. Saying those things out loud felt like stitching pieces of him back together. The journalist kept me informed as the case widened. Bigger names surfaced, connections I never would have imagined. Each revelation came with a familiar ache. Pride and sorrow tangled so tightly I couldn't separate them. Daniel had been brave, yes, but bravery had cost him his life. That truth never stopped hurting, no matter how meaningful people tried to make it sound. There were nights I lay awake wondering if things would have ended differently if I'd insisted he tell me everything, if I'd made it clear that whatever danger he was in, we'd face it together. One evening, I found myself opening the laptop again, not to search for clues, but to sit with it. I scrolled through mundane files I'd ignored before. Grocery lists, class schedules, notes he'd written to himself about deadlines and reminders to call his grandmother. Proof that alongside the danger and secrets, he'd been living an ordinary life, planning for a future he believed he'd reach. That hurt in a different way, but it also grounded me. Daniel wasn't defined by how he died, or even by what he uncovered. He was defined by the full span of his living. The trial process dragged on as these things do. Delays, motions, closed-door meetings. I attended when I could, sitting behind rows of strangers who knew my son's name but not his laugh. Sometimes the defense painted Daniel as reckless, implying he'd put himself in harm's way. Each time I felt a familiar surge of anger, but I learned to let it pass through me. I knew who my son was, and more importantly, I knew what he wasn't. He wasn't careless with truth. He wasn't someone who jumped. Outside the courtroom, I met parents of other whistleblowers, people who'd lost family members under similarly tidy explanations. We didn't need to share details. A look was enough. There was comfort in knowing I wasn't alone in this strange afterlife of grief mixed with purpose. Together, we talked about how love changes when your child becomes a symbol to others, how you have to reclaim them quietly, privately, so they don't disappear into the cause. At home, I made changes slowly. I moved Daniel's laptop from the dining table to a shelf in the living room, where it felt less like evidence and more like a relic. I donated some of his clothes, keeping the ones that still smelled faintly like him. I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by loss, not because I was forgetting him, but because I was finally carrying him with me instead of dragging his absence behind me. One afternoon, I received a message from a young man who said Daniel had helped him once, anonymously, with a problem that could have ruined his career. He wrote about a stranger who'd chosen integrity without expecting recognition. I read the message 3 times, my chest tight, and realized that Daniel's life had rippled outwards in ways I'd never know completely. That knowledge softened something in me. It reminded me that impact isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and ongoing, like a signal that keeps transmitting long after the source is gone. The case eventually reached a point where my presence wasn't required as often. Lawyers handled details, journalists moved on to the next story. The world kept turning, indifferent as ever. In that space, I found myself standing at a crossroads I hadn't expected. I could let the story remain a chapter defined by loss and exposure, or I could decide what meaning, if any, it would hold for the rest of my life. I chose to speak when invited, to tell Daniel's story not as a cautionary tale, but as a human one. I talked about the cost of truth and the necessity of support. I talked about how silence can feel like safety until it becomes a prison. And I talked about my own mistakes, my own blindness, because pretending otherwise wouldn't honor him. Each time I spoke, I felt a little lighter, like grief was being redistributed into something more manageable. Late one night, I sat on the porch and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood settling down. I thought about the father I'd been and the father I was becoming. I couldn't go back and change what I'd missed, but I could live in a way that kept Daniel's values alive. Curiosity, courage, care. Those were the things he'd left me, more enduring than any file or recording. Grief doesn't end. It evolves. It sharpens, dulls, resurfaces when you least expect it, but it teaches you how to live with an open heart in a world that doesn't guarantee safety. As I stood there in the quiet, I understood that uncovering the truth hadn't destroyed my memories of my son. It had deepened them, and in that depth, I found something close to peace. Time did what it always does. It moved forward without asking if I was ready. Seasons changed, headlines faded, and Daniel's case slipped from the front pages into quieter conversations held behind desks and closed doors. I learned that justice, even when it shows up, rarely arrives with ceremony. It comes in increments, a plea deal here, a sealed document there. Each development carried weight, but none of them gave me the clean sense of resolution I'd once imagined. Closure, I was learning, isn't an event. It's a practice. I started volunteering at a local support group for families who'd lost children under sudden or unclear circumstances. At first, I just listened. I recognized the look in their eyes, that combination of exhaustion and alertness, like they were bracing for impact that had already happened. They asked me how I had found the strength to keep going. I told them the truth. I hadn't found it. I'd stumbled into it, one decision at a time, mostly because stopping felt worse. One evening, a mother approached me after the meeting and asked if she should open her daughter's phone. It had been sitting in a drawer for 3 years. I saw myself in her hesitation, the fear that whatever she found might rearrange her grief into something sharper. I didn't tell her yes or no. I told her that avoiding the truth doesn't preserve peace. It just delays the moment you have to meet it. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and thanked me. I hoped, whatever she chose, that she'd be gentle with herself. At home, I found myself talking to Daniel more often, not in a way that made me worry about my sanity, but in the quiet, reflective way you speak to someone whose influence still shapes your choices. I told him about the small victories, about the days when his name didn't feel like a wound, about the moments when I laughed without guilt. I imagined him listening, patient as he'd always been, letting me take my time. The company at the center of everything eventually dissolved under the weight of investigations and fines. Executives resigned. Statements were issued that said everything and nothing at once. Some people called it accountability. Others called it too little, too late. For me, it was a reminder that systems rarely fall all at once. They erode, slowly, often invisibly. Daniel had understood that. He'd pushed anyway. I was asked to testify at a closed hearing, my voice recorded for the official record. Sitting in that room, I spoke carefully, aware that my words would be archived long after I was gone. I talked about the data, yes, but I also talked about my son as a person, about his curiosity, about his stubborn sense of right and wrong. I wanted the record to reflect that this wasn't just a case file corrected, it was a life acknowledged. Afterward, I walked out into the sunlight and felt an unexpected sense of relief, not because it was over, but because I'd said what needed saying. There's power in naming the truth, even when it doesn't undo the past. Especially then. I went to a cafe nearby and ordered coffee, something I hadn't done in that part of the city since before Daniel died. The taste was familiar, grounding. Life, I realized, continues not by forgetting, but by weaving memory into the ordinary. I began writing, not for publication, but for myself. I wrote letters to Daniel I never planned to send. I wrote about the night I first turned on his laptop, about the fear and the anger and the moment everything changed. Putting it into words helped me see the arc of it all. the way denial had protected me until it didn't, the way truth had hurt me and healed me in equal measure. Writing became another form of listening, another way to stay connected without getting lost. There were setbacks, days when an unexpected email or a passing comment reopened everything. I learned to expect those days instead of resenting them. Grief doesn't move in a straight line. It circles back, testing what you've learned. Each time I met it with a little more patience, with the knowledge that pain doesn't mean failure. It means love hasn't gone anywhere. One afternoon, I received a call from a young journalist just starting out. She said Daniel's story was one of the reasons she'd chosen her field. She asked me what advice I'd give to someone who wanted to tell difficult truths responsibly. I thought about it longer than she probably expected. Then I said, "Remember there are families behind every fact, and never assume silence means consent." She thanked me, her voice steady but emotional. When we hung up, I sat quietly, letting the weight of that moment settle. Daniel's influence was still moving forward, still shaping choices he'd never see. As the years stacked up, I noticed a shift in how I remembered him. The bridge no longer dominated the picture. It was there, yes, but smaller, less central. In its place were memories of him laughing at his own jokes, concentrating as he fixed something, standing in the doorway unsure whether to stay or go. Those memories felt more honest, more complete. They weren't overshadowed by a lie anymore. I took a walk one evening as the sun went down, the sky streaked with colors Daniel used to photograph obsessively. I realized then that uncovering the truth hadn't destroyed my last memories of my son. It had given them room to breathe. It had allowed me to love him as he was, not as the story said he was. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's a simple one, though not an easy one. Don't confuse comfort with truth, and don't assume that knowing less will hurt less. Sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is keep asking questions, even when the answers threaten to change everything. I turned back towards home, carrying Daniel with me in a way that felt lighter, steadier, not because the pain was gone, but because it finally had a place to rest. There came a point when the world stopped asking me about Daniel's case. Not abruptly, not cruelly, just gradually, the way attention always drifts. New scandals replaced old ones, new tragedies crowded out familiar names. I'd expected that moment to feel like abandonment, but instead it felt like permission. Permission to stop being on display, permission to grieve without witnesses. I noticed it first when a week passed without a single call from a reporter or lawyer. The silence unsettled me. For so long, my days had been structured around responses, explanations, clarifications. Without them, I had to decide who I was when no one was asking. I realized I'd been holding my breath for years, living in a state of readiness, waiting for the next revelation or demand. Letting that go took practice. I filled the quiet with routine, morning walks, cooking meals I used to rush through, fixing things around the house I'd ignored because they didn't matter when everything else felt broken. These were small acts, but they grounded me. They reminded me that life is mostly made of unremarkable moments, and that surviving grief doesn't require heroics. It requires showing up. Every so often, someone new would reach out, a student writing a paper, a parent on the edge of opening a drawer they'd kept closed. I answered when I could, careful not to let their urgency pull me back into a role I couldn't live in forever. I learned to set boundaries without guilt. Daniel's story mattered, but so did my capacity to keep living. One letter arrived from a man who'd worked briefly at the company Daniel had tried to expose. He wrote that he'd quit shortly after Daniel's death, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. He thanked me for proving he hadn't imagined it. His words stayed with me, not because they offered validation, but because they showed how far doubt can spread when truth is suppressed. One person's silence creates another's confusion. one lie echoes longer than we expect. I spent more time with my sister and her kids. Watching them grow was bittersweet, but it anchored me in the present. They asked about their cousins sometimes, simple questions without the weight adults carry. I told them stories that made him real, not tragic. The way he used to sneak extra marshmallows into his hot chocolate, the way he pretended to be annoyed when he was actually pleased. In those moments, Daniel wasn't a headline or a symbol, he was family. There were still days when the old anger resurfaced, sharp and sudden, usually when I encountered someone speaking casually about suicide, about assumptions made too easily. I learned to breathe through it, to remind myself that not every battle needed my voice. Some truths are better honored quietly, through how you live rather than what you argue. I returned to the support group less often, not because it stopped mattering, but because I sensed when it was time to step back. Others were ready to take the space I'd occupied. I stayed connected in smaller ways, checking in, offering a listening ear when asked. Grief communities, I learned, function best when no one tries to lead forever. We pass the torch without ceremony, trusting someone else to hold the light for a while. One rainy afternoon, I finally sorted through the last box from the closet. Inside were things I hadn't had the courage to face before. A notebook from Daniel's childhood filled with drawings and half-written stories. He'd always liked beginnings more than endings. I sat on the floor and read through them slowly, smiling at his imagination, his earnestness. There was a story about a bridge in one of them, written when he was 8. In it, the bridge wasn't a place to fall from. It was a place where people stopped to look at the water and decide where they were going next. I closed the notebook and let myself cry, not from pain alone, but from the strange tenderness of coincidence. I thought often about the version of myself from 7 years ago, the man who couldn't open a laptop because he was afraid of what it might say about his failures. I wanted to tell him that fear wouldn't protect him, that waiting wouldn't preserve his son. But I also understood him better now. We do what we can with what we have at the time. Compassion, I learned, has to extend backward as well as forward. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, I didn't go to the bridge. I didn't visit the grave either. Instead, I took a long drive, no destination in mind. I let the road carry me through places we'd never been, through towns that didn't know our story. Somewhere along the way, I pulled over and turned off the engine, listening to the ticking sound as it cooled. I spoke to Daniel then, telling him where I was, what I'd learned, how I was trying to live. I told him I missed him without apology. I told him I was okay. Driving home, I realized something that surprised me. The truth I'd uncovered hadn't kept me trapped in the past. It had freed me from it, not by erasing what happened, but by allowing it to be what it was without distortion. Lies trap us in endless what-ifs. Truth, even painful truth, gives us solid ground to stand on. I don't know how Daniel would feel about everything that followed. I can't know, but I believe he'd understand why I did what I did, not out of vengeance, not to make sense of the senseless, but out of love that refused to accept an ending that didn't fit the life that came before it. As I pulled into my driveway, the house dark and quiet, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for the loss, never for that, but for the clarity that came after, for the knowledge that love doesn't end at death and responsibility doesn't either. We carry both, learning their weight as we go. And if there's one thing I hope someone listening takes from this, it's this. Don't let fear decide the final version of someone you love. Ask the questions, open the box, trust that truth, however hard, will ultimately treat your heart with more respect than silence ever could. By the time the 8th year arrived,
I had stopped counting days since Daniel died and started counting days since I last felt anchored in the present. That shift mattered more than I expected. It didn't mean I thought about him less. It meant I thought about him differently. Memory, when it's no longer under siege, has a way of rearranging itself into something gentler. I took a part-time job at the local library, shelving books and helping people find what they didn't know how to ask for. It surprised me how much I liked it. There was a quiet order to the place, a respect for stories in all their forms. Sometimes I imagine Daniel there, browsing without a plan, getting distracted by titles that promised answers he wasn't sure he wanted. I never told my coworkers about my past. I liked being just another man in the stacks, useful and unremarkable. One afternoon, a teenager asked me where to find books on computer security. His question was casual, but it stirred something in me. I showed him the section, asked what he was interested in. He shrugged, said he liked figuring out how things worked. I nodded, feeling the familiar ache and pride rise together. Before he left, I told him to be careful with his curiosity, not because it was dangerous, but because it was powerful. He laughed, probably thinking I was being dramatic. Maybe I was. Or maybe I was speaking to a version of my son that still existed in the world, scattered among other young minds. At home, I finally decided what to do with Daniel's laptop. I didn't want it to remain frozen in time, but I couldn't bring myself to erase it either. I backed everything up carefully, creating multiple copies, stored in different places. Then I wiped the device and donated it to a community center, a quiet way of letting it return to the world. The data lived on, protected, but the object itself was free. When I dropped it off, I felt a surprising sense of relief, like I'd honored both the past and the future in one small act. The legal aftermath reached its final phase that year. Sentences were handed down, statements were read. I attended the last hearing, sitting quietly, hands folded, listening to language that tried to quantify harm. When it was over, people looked at me as if waiting for a reaction. I didn't give them one. There was nothing left to prove. Justice, imperfect as it was, had done what it could within its limits. My work, I knew, lay elsewhere now. I went back to writing, shaping my notes into something more coherent. Not a book, not yet, just a record. I wanted Daniel's story preserved without the noise that had surrounded it. I wrote in the evenings, slow and deliberate, letting memories surface without forcing them. Some nights I wrote only a paragraph, others pages poured out. There was no deadline. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't respond well to schedules. One evening, as I reread what I'd written, I realized the story had shifted again. It wasn't centered on the mystery anymore. It was centered on relationship, on the spaces between a father and son, where words went unsaid, where assumptions settled in like dust. That realization stung, but it also felt honest. The mystery had brought me here. Love was what stayed. I received an invitation to speak at a small conference about digital ethics. I almost declined. The idea of stepping back into that world felt heavy, but something in me said yes. When I stood at the podium looking out at faces both young and old, I told them about Daniel without sensationalism. I talked about responsibility, about what happens when systems reward silence and punish conscience. I ended by saying that data tells stories, whether we intend it to or not, and that we are accountable for the stories we choose to ignore. The applause was polite, restrained. It was enough. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her brother had died under unclear circumstances years ago, and she'd never questioned the official story because it felt disloyal. She said, "You showed me that asking questions is another way of loving." Her words stayed with me long after she left. I carried them like a small light. On the anniversary of Daniel's birth, I cooked his favorite meal and ate it alone at the kitchen table.
I didn't feel sad, I felt connected. I talked to him about ordinary things, about the library, about the teenager with the computer books, about the way the sky looked that evening. I realized then that my relationship with my son hadn't ended. It had changed form, but it was still active, still shaping me. As night settled in, I stepped outside and looked up at the stars. Daniel used to point out constellations, even when he wasn't entirely sure he was right. He'd say, "It's about the pattern, not perfection." I smiled at the memory. Patterns, that's what he'd followed. Patterns in data, in behavior, in lies. Patterns were what saved the truth eventually. I went back inside and closed the door gently, a habit I'd developed without noticing. There was peace in that gesture, care, intention. The house no longer felt like a shrine or a crime scene. It felt like a home again, shaped by loss but not defined by it. If this story has taught me anything, it's that truth doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, asking us to grow into it. And love, real love, grows with it, stretching to accommodate new understanding without breaking. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I felt Daniel's presence not as a wound, but as a steady influence, guiding me toward a life that honored both what we lost and what we learned. Years later, I still catch myself reaching for Daniel in small ways. Sometimes it's the way he used to leave his shoes by the door, or the mug he favored still sitting on the counter. I don't rearrange them. I don't move them to a drawer or put them away. They remind me that the past isn't something to hide from. It's something to carry with intention. Presence doesn't vanish with death. It simply changes shape. I've learned to feel him in the rhythm of daily life, in moments both ordinary and extraordinary. The legal battles faded completely. Executives were gone, settlements were recorded, and the journalists moved on to other stories. But the story of my son, Daniel, never left me. It didn't need a headline. It didn't need applause. It needed acknowledgement, careful and persistent, and that acknowledgement became my life's quiet work. I visited schools to talk about ethics, accountability, and courage, but more often I spoke privately to those who struggled with fear or secrecy, helping them see that the choice to speak, to act, to confront difficult truths doesn't erase you, it defines you. I kept writing, compiling letters, transcripts, screenshots, and recovered files, not as evidence, but as an archive for understanding. One day I realized it had become something more than that. It had become a testament to a life that had been misrepresented, a record for anyone who might face the same impossible choices Daniel did. I didn't intend for it to be read widely, but when I did share it with select readers, I noticed the effect. People paused, they listened, they questioned the stories they'd been told. That was enough. The bridge no longer haunted me. I went there one late afternoon, not to mourn, but to remember. The place that had once been a symbol of lies and finality now felt quieter, more like a waypoint than a destination. I traced the edges of the walkway with my fingers along the railing, imagining Daniel there, not jumping, not trapped, but standing, choosing, resisting, fighting, living. It wasn't an image of him that could undo the pain of his loss, but it was an image that restored agency to the story I thought had been stolen from us both. Sometimes I still relive the moments when I first uncovered the truth, the shock, the fear, the helplessness, and the rage. Those moments remain vivid because they were the points where love became action. Grief alone teaches you little. Action rooted in love teaches you survival. And in those moments, I realized that the love I had for Daniel wasn't simply the love of a father for a son. It was the love of a father for truth itself and the courage to pursue it no matter the cost. I've met parents whose children died and were declared lost to suicide, and I've shared my story with them quietly, not to offer closure, because I know closure is often a myth, but to show that questions matter, that seeking truth isn't betrayal, that believing in your child after death, even when everyone else has given up, is a form of fidelity stronger than fear. I tell them that silence often protects no one, courage does. At home, I keep Daniel's recovered files carefully archived. I glance at the folder occasionally, not obsessively, but with a quiet respect. Each fragment, each corrupted video, each GPS log was a piece of a life that was deliberately hidden. Now that they exist in my custody, they have meaning. They aren't just evidence of wrongdoing, they are evidence of Daniel's mind, his bravery, his will to do what was right, even when the world made it impossible. The files are no longer burdens, they are his voice, finally preserved, finally heard. I still dream of him. Sometimes he is laughing, teasing me like he did when he was alive. Sometimes he's serious, warning me about a danger I hadn't noticed. Rarely the dreams revisit that bridge, but never as an ending. In my dreams, he's always moving beyond it, always choosing another path. When I wake, the memory is not of despair, but of guidance. That's the legacy I carry now. Love and vigilance intertwined, memory and action inseparable. Life goes on in strange ways. I attend birthdays and anniversaries, sometimes alone, sometimes with family. I've allowed myself joy again, small and persistent. I feel gratitude in moments I didn't think I could ever reach again, for the laughter of grandchildren I never had, for quiet dinners where conversation flows easily, for the taste of coffee in the morning, for the smell of rain on the street. These things are ordinary, yes, but they are precious because they exist alongside memory, not in the shadow of it. The moral I carry, more clearly now than ever, is simple. Love is not measured by the absence of grief, but by the courage it inspires. Loving someone means fighting for their story when they cannot. It means asking hard questions, listening without judgment, honoring truths that may hurt. Most of all, it means recognizing that agency, the ability to act, to resist, to choose, is sacred, that truth above all deserves protection. One quiet evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's notebook open. I traced the lines of his handwriting, smiling at the small sketches and unfinished stories. I realized that even in his absence, he had guided me. His courage became a blueprint for my own life. His choices, once hidden, now shape the way I act, the way I see the world. His love, expressed through rebellion, curiosity, and persistence, teaches me how to love others fully, honestly, and without reservation. I don't pretend the grief is gone. I don't pretend it doesn't flare up in unexpected moments, a song, a photograph, a passing conversation. But I've learned that grief is not a prison, it's a companion. It walks with you, reminding you of what matters, guiding you toward choices you might not otherwise make. In this way, Daniel is still with me. In this way, he is still teaching me even after death. And so, I continue to live, not in denial, not in fear, but in a life shaped by both loss and discovery, by both sorrow and hope. Each day I honor him through the choices I make, the truths I preserve, and the love I extend. I speak his name aloud, not as a call to mourn, but as a call to remember, to act, to love. And in doing so, I keep the bridge from defining him, keep the lie from defining us, and keep his voice alive in a world that sometimes prefers silence over justice. Daniel's story, once stolen, now belongs to him again, and to all of us who learn from it. It is a story of love, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. It is a story of a father and a son, of grief transformed into action, of life continuing, not despite loss, but because of it. And as I close the door to another ordinary day, I feel the weight of both memory and freedom carrying me forward, carrying him forward, carrying us both toward a future shaped not by lies, but by love.